first killing, nor was it the first time Peter had been re-released back into the community. So who was Peter Bryan, and how was this allowed to happen? Peter Bryan was born in London on the 4th of October 1969, and he was the youngest of 7 children born to immigrant parents from Barbados. Peter attended Shaftesbury Junior School in Forest Gate, London, before attending Trinity Senior School in Canning Town in London. He left school at the age of 15 and quickly obtained employment at a clothes store before going on to teach cooking lessons at his local soup kitchen. Peter first became known to the law in 1987 when he was living in the Flying Angel Flats in Custom House, London. Police were called to the flats after he attempted to throw another resident off the flats from his 6th floor window. The victim told police that it was an unprovoked attack, and police arrested Peter. However, he was not charged for this attack. Peter's next reported crime came in March of 1993. This was when Peter reportedly found his appetite for killing. He had been working as a shop assistant at a fashionable boutique in London's King's Road. Whilst working here, he had fallen in love with a young woman named Nisha. She was the 20-year-old daughter of the shop's owner. Nisha did not welcome Peter's attention, but he continued to pursue her. However, he was caught stealing clothes from the shop and sacked. On March the 18th, 1993, Peter, then aged 23, returned to the shop to get his revenge. Nisha and her 12-year-old brother Bobby were present at the shop when Peter stormed in and knocked young Bobby to the ground. He then immediately attacked Nisha with a claw hammer, hitting her repeatedly around the head. A passerby saw the attack and called for paramedics. However, Nisha sadly died before the ambulance arrived on scene. Peter had fled the scene, and an hour later, and high on cannabis, Peter jumped from the 3rd floor balcony of a building in apparent suicide attempt. He survived and admitted the manslaughter of Nisha on grounds of diminished responsibility. For this, Peter was sent to the Rampton Secure Hospital without a limit of time. The Rampton Hospital is a high-security psychiatric hospital based in Nottinghamshire in England. It is one of only 3 high-security psychiatric hospitals in the country, alongside Ashworth Hospital in Merseyside and the most well-known Broadmoor Hospital in Berkshire. After only being detained for 8 years and with a diagnosis of schizophrenia, Peter was set to be transferred to yet another unit. This unit was called the John Howard Centre, and he was to be transferred after a 6-month trial leave project that was agreed by the Home Office. The John Howard Centre is a facility for people with mental health problems who have been arrested, are on remand, or have been to court and found guilty of a crime. Peter's transfer from Rampton to the John Howard Centre happened in June of 2001. Only a year after arriving, Peter reapplied to a mental health review tribunal, and he was then moved to a riverside hostel in North London. In this hostel he could come and go as he pleased without supervision, but he wasn't at the riverside long, and his stay here ended when he was caught being inappropriate with a 16-year-old girl that was living there at the time. As psychiatrists felt Peter had made a continued improvement in his mental health, it was then decided that he be moved to an even more independent accommodation. So in January 2004, Peter's social workers applied for his transfer to an open psychiatric ward at Newham General Hospital in London. This is the same hospital that my own son was born in at the time Peter was a resident. She immediately noted a strong smell of disinfectant. Peter then emerged from the living room bare-chested, holding a knife, and he simply announced, "Bryan's dead." Nicola, however, did not believe Peter, despite the fact he was holding a bloodied knife, so she peered into Bryan's bedroom, where she saw Bryan lying naked on the floor, with one of his arms clearly separated from his body. She fled from the flat and immediately called the police. When the police arrived, they found Peter standing in the hallway in the dark, with blood-stained hands, jeans and trainers. In the kitchen, officers noted a small amount of meat in the frying pan next to an open tub of butter. They also saw more brain tissue and hair matted with blood on a plate beside the draining board. It was established that Bryan's skull had been smashed open with at least 24 blows from a hammer, and his head was partly sawn off. His right leg had been hacked off and both arms. The entire living room was soaked in blood, and 3 blood-stained knives were later found on the floor. Peter was arrested, charged and remanded in Broadmoor after appearing in court for Bryan's murder. Peter's trial began on the 15th of March 2005, and again he admitted manslaughter on the grounds of diminished responsibility. Judge Giles Forrester told Peter, quote, "You killed on at least 2 occasions because it gave you a thrill and a feeling of power when you ate flesh." End quote. Peter was sentenced to a whole life tariff. However, in 2006, the Lord Chief Justice Lord Phillips overturned the whole life tariff, but said it was unlikely Peter would ever be released. The sentence was put on file as a minimum of 15 years, and Peter was committed to Broadmoor. On the 25th of April, while in Broadmoor, Peter killed again. He attacked Richard Loudwell, a 60-year-old man who was awaiting trial for the murder of an 82-year-old woman. At around 6:10 p.m, 3 members of staff heard 2 loud bangs coming from the dining room, and they found Richard lying on the floor next to a table. Richard's face was covered in blood, and there was a strangulation mark around his neck. It transpired Peter had attacked Richard, slamming his head repeatedly into the table before placing a cord around Richard's neck. Richard died on the 5th of June from bronchopneumonia that was caused by severe brain injuries. Peter admitted attacking Richard and told doctors, quote, "I get urges, you see. I've had these urges ever since I first saw Richard. He's the bottom of the food chain. He's old and haggard and looked like he'd had his innings." End quote. He went on to say he had been waiting to attack, kill and eat him, but didn't have much time, and said if he did have more time, he wanted to cook and eat him. It's now 2021 and Peter still remains in Broadmoor, but how was a man who is clearly a danger to the public able to be released? I personally think that Peter was a clever man who manipulated those assigned to treat him into believing he wasn't a danger. Peter had even bragged to fellow patients in Broadmoor that he believes he got a good result being sent to hospital rather than prison, and stated if he played it right, he'd be out in 7 years. He said this after he killed Richard. He clearly played all that saw him within the psychiatric units he lived in, and is clearly a danger to anyone, and this is unlikely to change. So let's hope Peter Bryan